Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC Winter Split Week number 2 overview and analysis video. Of course, power rankings at the end, all of the fun stuff included. We're really getting a pretty good idea of which teams are going to be at the top of the standings, at least in terms of consistency here in this best of one stage, and which teams are just not particularly good. This was a much more defined week, in my opinion, than week number 1, as week 2 typically is, and I think we're getting a lot better of a clearer picture, we'll just say, about which teams are going to be kind of competing for that LEC title, which teams are going to be competing to go to first stand, and which teams are probably going to be making a lot of changes already early on into the season. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. If you want to check out my week 1 video, it's up in the iCard right now. The LEC playlist is going to be up there. That's going to include both the primer at the beginning of the year and the week 1 video. Of course, quite a lot has changed already since then, so you don't need to watch that in order to get my opinions. I will be talking about a lot of my previous takes in this and whether or not they've aged well, as I always do, but you can always check those out if you are interested. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. I will be updating my personal power rankings at the end of the video as well, from number 1 to number 10. Again, 3 best of ones for every single team across this entire week, 15 best of ones to cover across 3 days. Very excited, but there's a lot to cover, so let's not waste too much time. Let's get into the analysis, starting with day number 1, and pretty predictable outcome here in our first game of day 1. It was Rogue taking on Fnatic, and Fnatic is going to pick up the victory here. They're going to move to 3-1, and this is not unexpected. It's nice to see Fnatic come out and look really good here at the start of the week, though. This was a team that I think didn't necessarily have a ton of consistency in week number 1. Like, their record looked pretty good, but I think that there were a lot of ways that they could continue to improve. And while I certainly don't think this game was a blowout by any means, it's not like they were, constantly dominating and the only team that was ever in a good position and it was a 25-minute win and it was never close. Like, that's not what this game was. It still was a showcase, in my opinion, that they have enough talent to be able to outclass a lot of the other teams that are near the middle. I don't think Rogue is a world beater or anything like that, but I also don't think they're, like, awful. Like, I think they have ways to win games. I just think that they aren't particularly consistent in a couple of key areas. So we'll talk about that. Player of the game is pretty obviously going to go to Oscar Rinnan on the top side here on the Ambessa. What an important Ambessa game. We talk about Oscar a lot being this feast or famine top laner. I've seen a lot of people, even in my comment section over my LTA videos, compare him to someone like Fudge. I think the reason I've always been lower on Oscar than I am on other players like Fudge or, like these other feast or famine top laners like Irrelevant or Adam that I think are maybe above him in terms of my expectations is because I just don't know if he has the mechanical ceiling to be able to reach the highs, like the feast games that those players end up having. But, he does sometimes prove me wrong. There have been, splashes, we'll just say here and there, where things do end up looking great, and this was one of them. Adam is obviously not off to a ridiculous start. He was okay in week number 1, certainly was very good in their win, but not so great in their losses, and Oscar was just straight up better than him in this performance, which is very important. If he's going to be anywhere near, like, top 3 or top 4 in terms of top laners, which I do think is realistic for someone like Oscar, if he can start putting a lot of stuff together, that is going to change the complexion of what Fnatic ends up being as a team. And I do think the Ambessa is obviously a great champion for him. We always talked about the Cassante really being like a key piece of Fnatic's success for a lot of last year. I think Ambessa can fill a very similar role and do a lot of similar things. I just think she might be even stronger in terms of what it is right now for especially what Oscar wants to do. So credit to him. I thought he was really important. I also want to give a big shout out to Upset. I know his scoreline doesn't necessarily look great, but for a player who's kind of been a KDA player, we'll just say, over the course of his career, kind of in that same mold as someone like a Teddy over in the LCK, he really did not play for KDA in this game. He was positioning really well, maybe a little bit too passively for my liking, but it's Kai'Sa and you're playing against Xin Zhao and Cassante and Rel and Orianna and even the Varus. Right? It's so many tools that can catch you if you're out of position. He was playing really safe, but when he did pull the trigger, he was doing so much damage in this game. He was doing a really good job, I think, of expressing a lot of what, makes Kai'Sa really strong in this current meta. He certainly was better than his opposition on the other side. Mickey looked pretty comfortable on the Galio. That's basically a triple flex in this current meta, and Razork and Huma were fine. They didn't really have to do all that much. Oscar did a lot of the heavy lifting in team fights, and I think Upset was kind of the secondary option there. This game was really slow, definitely not an action-packed, like, fast-paced game by any stretch of the imagination. This was much more, both teams just feeling each other out and trying to gain small macro advantages, and Fnatic, being the more experienced team with more experienced wins under their belt, they were just going to be better at that. Rogue obviously has a lot of experience, but these players have not necessarily been in a lot of winning situations recently, and so not surprising to see Fnatic take a slower-paced game and a more, I don't want to say passive, but kind of tense and, one fight opens up the game type of game and turn that into a win for themselves. And then for Rogue on the other side, they're just not particularly good. They're not awful. I think there are things that this team does that I think could be, something they build upon to beat some of the bad teams across the rest of this split. I'm specifically looking at mid jungle, which seems to be generally fine. Malrang, I had some major concerns about going into this split, and while he's not been exceptional, he's certainly not transformed this team into a top 4, top 5 team or anything like that. He's not been a disaster either. I think Larssen is also generally fine. Larssen is the player that he is. At this point, there's really no, debating on whether or not Larssen is going to change up his style. He's going to play super passive in the early and the mid game, and he's going to try to win these 5v5 team fights. He's still very good in that phase, and it's why Rogue plays so slow, because they're playing around Larssen, but he's not going to be a game breaker. The days where he's like a top 2 or a top 3 mid laner in the LEC do seem like they are over. Execute was also fine in this game on the rel, but dud of the game for me is going to go to Patrick in the bot lane role. This might be surprising considering the score lines on this team. You could look at his 3-2-2 score line and say that he was actually really valuable, but his, bad positioning, we'll just say, in the back half of this game is kind of why Rogue wasn't able to compete with Fnatic and why their problems were just so much bigger than Fnatic's were on the other side. He's just not there right now. I don't know if it's mental. I don't know if the mechanics are just gone. I don't really know what it is, but Patrick over the last 2 years has been absolutely prolific at getting caught out in the later half of the game. Very Leave-esque if you follow the LPL, where it's just like one moment at 20 minutes where he just randomly dies every game. It's backbreaking for Rogue, and right now he looks like one of the weaker players in the LEC in terms of his raw mechanics. I was already pretty out on him going into the year because last year I think he was a hindrance for GIANTX. It feels like he's gotten worse and worse ever since 2019, 2020. It feels like the trajectory has really been downhill ever since then. Once 2022 didn't work out with Mickey X, it just didn't really feel like it was ever going to work out for Patrick at a top level, and right now it just feels like he is kind of holding this team back in that regard. We'll see if that ends up carrying over. Again, it's not like the rest of this team is dominating. Malrang was fine here, but you need to push advantages on Xin Zhao a lot more than he did. Same thing for Execute on the rel. I just want to see them be a lot more aggressive. Adam needs to be better on the top side, but you kind of expect that there are going to be a couple of games every split where he's just not great and a couple of games where he is phenomenal. And then if they are going to continue to play slow, they need to have a much clearer idea of how to execute on that with players like Larssen and Patrick in the late game. But this is a nice win for Fnatic, not a groundbreaking one or anything like that, but certainly one that they're going to feel good about. And, moving to 3-1 is definitely going to be the prize here. But then moving on to our second game of day number 1, and a little bit of an upset here, definitely some bad execution. It's Team BDS taking on Team Heretics, and Heretics is going to pick up the win here. They're going to move to 500, 2-2, same thing with BDS on this loss. Both teams moving to 2-2 after their first 4 best of ones. Not a good loss for BDS. I actually feel really bad for Nuke and Ice, who continue to be really strong players, but man, these rookies are having a really tough time adapting. I say rookies, 113 is obviously played before here, but these players coming up from the ERLs, from the LFL, they are having a very difficult time adapting to the LEC at the current moment. Hopefully things do end up getting better for them. Sometimes it can just be a difficult transition to go from tier 2 to tier 1, even if, they're very good players and very good prospects. We've seen it before with good players struggling at the beginning, but there are some very concerning tendencies, and I would say it's definitely less so here in Europe than it is in a lot of other regions. We've seen a lot of rookies end up doing really well. That's not the case right now for BDS's rookies, and for Heretics, I really do think they're going to get undersold for how well they played this game because BDS played it pretty poorly. People are going to point to BDS kind of throwing and putting themselves in a bad position, where I think Heretics was mostly the one that was creating a lot of the good positions they were in, specifically Flacket, who is a very easy choice for player of the game. What a carry performance from Flacket. This truly was an excellent showing from him. I got some flack in my primer video for putting Flacket ahead of some of these AD carries that other people really like, players like Upset and players like Kalist as well, who obviously hadn't played a single game in the LEC yet, but I got a lot of criticism for putting Flacket above those players because I think people just don't really get how good Flacket is individually as a player. This guy's really, really good. He's very mechanically talented. He is a primary option on a pretty decent, size team. Obviously Heretics isn't expected to be great or anything like that, but this is a guy who can be a primary option and was a primary option at the end of last year for a Heretics team that had other good players like Yankos on it. And so I really do think people just underestimate how good Flacket is and how much he has improved as a player. I think he could be a top 2 or top 3 bot laner if he were on a better team that was able to get him better resources. We'll just say that, or more consistent resources. But Heretics looked good basically across the board in this one. Outside of Flacket, everybody else was more so, I would say, along for the ride. Camelou is obviously still going to get a lot of, publicity and press because of that Smolder game. I was pretty critical of the Smolder in draft, but it really ends up working out when the Alistar and Sejuani on the other side of this map basically give you free stacks throughout the entirety of this game and give you free kills. I thought Carlson was really solid on the top side. He was bad in week number 1. He looked like he was going to be a bit of a disaster here for Heretics, at least in the beginning part, like maybe the worst top laner in the league, but he had his best game at the LEC level here against Irrelevant, who is a solid enough player. Certainly not someone to freak out about. Stend was solid as well. The Rel was definitely there to set up for the Varus and the Smolder. This is a very important game for the Rel in particular when you look at how Heretics is constructed, and I think Stend did a great job being the better of these two rookie supports. I think is a really, really big positive for Heretics, and, I'm a fan of Stend. I like him as a player. I think the bot lane generally looks good right now. And then Sheo kind of getting one over on his former team. They replaced him with 113, and 113 goes on to lose BDS the game in a lot of different ways here. Sheo is obviously going to feel pretty happy about that, even if I don't think he was particularly relevant throughout the entirety of this game, mostly just the later half of the game here on Zyra. But Flacket really was the hard carry for Heretics, and that's probably going to be what a lot of their wins throughout this year are. Camelou obviously looked okay in week number 1, very hit or miss in that regard, but if this team is going to randomly be top 6 or top 7, or if this team is going to be anything other than bottom 2, it's likely going to be through Flacket. And then for BDS on the other side, it's just unfortunate. Nuke and Ice played pretty well. Nuke in particular had an excellent game on the Corki. He definitely deserved to win this one. I think he was going right up there with Flacket in terms of being able to try to carry this game. Even if I do think Flacket was a little bit better, I'm not trying to say Nuke was the best player in this game or anything like that, but 113 in Paris just completely let this BDS team down. Whoever you want to give dud of the game to, I think is entirely fair. I'm giving it to 113. It felt like his plays were even more egregious, especially in the back half where it felt like the Sejuani was just running in to die over and over again. No communication, no synergy here for 113 with the rest of the team. That's going to have to get better. And you can say a similar thing about Paris, a player that I really hyped up. And obviously it wasn't just me. This was G2's #1 option in the offseason. They wanted Paris over Labrov, and Paris ended up choosing BDS. For him to come out and honestly not be particularly good through the first couple of weeks, it's not entirely, exhilarating for me. We'll just say Labrov obviously, hasn't exactly started off great for G2 either, but Paris needs to be better. He is a big reason why I felt so much optimism surrounding BDS, as it felt like Nuke and Ice could be primary options as either primary or secondary carries each, and then Irrelevant's going to be fine on the top side. I liked 113's tape, but Paris was really the glue piece that I thought was going to unlock BDS, and right now that's just not happening. Neither of the promotions from the LFL are looking particularly good for BDS, and they're going to have to get better. If 113 plays like this, or plays like he did on Astralis in his first tenure in the LEC, this is not going to be a top 6 team in the league. Same thing for Paris. If he's like a bottom 3 support in the league, this is not going to be a top 6 team. And I think anything other than like bare minimum top 6 would be an absolute disappointment for BDS. This was a team that I think had Worlds expectations going into the year. And then for Heretics on the other side, Flacket's really good. This team's not particularly well-rounded, and BDS gave them a ton of advantages throughout this game. Flacket and Sten can continue to be a really strong bot lane that I think they're going to be fine. Camelou, I think, has moments where he can pop off. He clearly has some mechanical talent. He's just not particularly experienced, and it's nice to see players like Carlson have their best game here, but, a win over a BDS team that's basically giving it to you is not going to skyrocket them up in the standings for me. Then moving on to our third game of day 1, and we finally get a bit of a back and forth affair where both teams are playing really well. It's GIANTX taking on Movistar KOI, and KOI is going to pick up the victory here, but both teams very much deserve a gigantic shout out for this performance. It was honestly really difficult to find a dud of the game for this one, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go along, because all 10 members of both teams in this game were excellent. I think both teams played at a super high level, and to me, this really solidifies that they are both in the top 4. I know things didn't go GIANTX's way in this one, but not only is it their first loss of the entire split, they go undefeated in week 1, obviously, going into this, but KOI is a really excellent team that I think is going to be competing to maybe even win the league here in winter, and GIANTX went toe-to-toe with them, and in a lot of ways, even outperformed them in some pivotal moments. And so I do really want to give a big shout out to GIANTX. These teams are both excellent, and I really don't want it to come across like I'm trying to criticize either coming out of this, especially after some of what we've seen already, like the Heretics versus BDS game. Both of those teams were worse than both of these teams in this game in terms of the performances that they gave. So credit to KOI. This team looks very consistent across the board. Player of the game to me pretty obviously has to go to Supa. This guy's on fire at the start of the split. I've always been a big Supa fan. I was a gigantic Supa defender last year. You know, I tweeted about it a lot on my Twitter. Small plug, go follow me there. I don't really tweet all that much anymore, but you can definitely still follow me there. That being said, I was tweeting a ton last year about how it's crazy to me that the LEC fans have basically been given like this really great superstar prospect, and all they did was turn on him because he had the gall to be a little bit confident, a little bit cocky, and make a really funny statement at the beginning of the year about Deft. Like, obviously, that's the kind of stuff you want to see out of these players, and kind of turned him into a pariah a bit for a lot of last year, but this guy was really good. He was my rookie of the year in all of the LEC because I think he was better across all three splits than someone like Jackie's was, even if Jackie's was definitely better in summer. Recency bias wasn't going to stop me from saying Supa had a better 2024 overall, and he continues to show that he is an emerging star in the AD carry role. By the end of the year, he could be the #1 ADC in the LEC, and I'm not going to be entirely surprised. That is a spot that is very much open for the taking, and he has played his way into that conversation. Him and Alvaro obviously have excellent chemistry together, coming from their time on Movistar and, you know, playing in the ERLs together. They, you know, carried that through to Mad Lions last year, and it's really, really solidified at the start of this year. They are excellent as a duo, maybe the best in the entire region right now, and it's really, really fun to see. But it's not just them. Like, obviously, Supa and Alvaro were excellent. The Braum was great. The Corki was taking over in terms of the damage. It was Jojo Pune, and it was, you know, the top side of the map as well that looked really good. Jojo in particular looked very good on the Taliyah, even with Jackie's having so much prio in the mid lane due to being very, very strong on this Akali. Jojo still did a very good job of playing the map, and I think that's something he's always been underrated for. People call him a selfish player in terms of his resource getting. That's not really been his style, at least at his most successful when he was on Evil Geniuses. He was much more of a facilitator in their first run when he was a rookie, when he got to play with players like Inspired and really open up the map in that way. You know, Jojo is a player that's more than happy to try to get his Corki into a position to win the game for him, and I do think that's exactly what happened here. Now, unfortunately, dud of the game did have to go to someone, and for me, it actually goes to Elyoya, but I don't want this to be a big indictment on Elyoya. Like I said, somebody had to get it here because that's just the format that we do on this channel, but all 10 players played really well. I just think there were a couple of engages, especially early on in the game, where the vibe was just a little bit too deep, and that's really the only criticism I can throw at Elyoya. Perhaps you could give this to Mirwin as well, just because he was not particularly active in the game overall. Wasn't really influencing the outcome all that much, but at the end of the day, like, Elyoya and Mirwin played fine. Like, in almost any other circumstance, they would not even be in the running for dead of the game. They didn't do any, like, major mistakes that cost KOI in, like, major ways or anything like that. I just had to give it to someone, and honestly, I just didn't feel good about giving it to anybody on GIANTX, who I think played really well and were really cohesive. So, you know, credit to KOI. Supa and Alvaro look excellent. Jojo looks really good right now in the mid lane, and honestly, topside looks good as well. Mirwin has been surviving on meta champions, which is a good sign, and Elyoya obviously is a big creator, even if he can be a little greedy at times. So KOI looking good, and then GIANTX looks really good as well. Jackie's was awesome in this game, really had an opportunity to be able to 1v9 at certain points on this Akali. This guy's really cementing himself as an upper tier mid laner with Jojo coming in, and, you know, obviously Jackie's re-emerging, Vladi re-emerging and kind of carrying a lot of that form from Summer in the same way. Like, it looks like a really stacked mid lane class right now, at least in terms of the young players that are coming through the league, or the inexperienced players that are coming through the league, and Jackie's might be leading the charge on that. He really is that damn good. This is a guy who I think is going to be a game breaker for a while. Again, I don't want to make this, you know, comparison completely, you know, directly, because this player's career obviously tailspun, but I see so much of, like, early VTO in Jackie's, like the Misfits version of VTO that ended up winning an MVP in Jackie's. I think those players are very similar and very comparable. Obviously, VTO could not keep that form up, has really ended up struggling in recent years. Hopefully, Jackie's has a slightly better trajectory than that, but this guy's so talented mechanically, and he can definitely carry when he's on things like Assassins. So credit to Jackie's. He tried his absolute best to win this game, and it's not like his team held him back. Noah and Jun, they're competing with Supa and Alvaro for the best bot lane in the league. Jun was my player of the week in week #1. It felt like he was dominating every game he was playing, and they still played really well here. They have great chemistry, and they've really upped the game of GIANTX. GIANTX. Closer was better than Elyoya at certain points in this game. The Sejuani was certainly super consistent at starting fights. I thought Lot continued to be very stable and, again, was more active on the top side than even Mirlin was on the other side of this matchup. There were so many things to praise for GIANTX. It felt like their macro was really good. They just got outplayed in a couple of key fights because Supa, Alvaro, and Jojo Pyun were really excellent at the end of this game. It's really nothing to be ashamed of. GIANTX is still going to be a team I have near the top of my rankings. And then for KOI, they're going to stay near the top of my rankings. They were already at number 3. They could even move up depending on how things go for the rest of this week. This looks like a team that is going to be competing for a title basically from day one, and I'm really happy to say that. Then moving on to game number 4 here of day number 1, and it's another almost 50-minute banger. It's Team Vitality taking on G2 Esports, and who would have guessed? The team with the smolder that gets to 50 minutes ends up winning the game. It's G2 picking up the win, and obviously there's a lot to talk about in terms of the meta with this one. I think that's where a lot of people are going to be kind of focusing a lot of their attention on, and I think some of it is rightfully so. You know, Smolder's really strong, and, you know, I think he's in a good spot to be able to carry games in the LEC in particular, but there's a reason we're not really seeing this champion in other regions, or at least we're not seeing him nearly as consistently as we're seeing him in the LEC. LEC teams are just scared and passive at the start of every year. This is kind of just how the LEC ends up going. These games are incredibly long. This has got to be the longest average region time in the world right now. LCK and LPL games are going like a little bit longer, but I'm talking like 35 minutes on average. We're not going 47 minutes in the LCK and the LPL all that frequently, and right now it just feels like the space that the LEC teams need to generate in the early game, it's just taking a lot more time for them to do that than it is for other teams. I think that has partly to do with them not being particularly synergistic at the current moment. It feels like a lot of teams are still trying to figure out their identity, but you know, there's definitely a small advantage in the market right now, we'll just say, for champions like Smolder in the LEC that it's not necessarily there for some of the other regions. That being said, Caps is player of the game. Not only does he go deathless in a 47-minute game on an 80 carry in the middle of the map, but he carries in terms of damage. And honestly, what would G2 be without Caps? There are so many times where I've asked myself that question. Broken Blade was excellent in this game, and we'll talk about the Cassante because he's part of the reason people are frustrated with this as well, but they would be nothing without Caps as a primary carry, a primary option for this team. Jungle and support continue to, quite frankly, disappoint a little bit here for G2. We'll get into that a bit later, but Caps is just so consistent as a late game carry, and he knows where he needs to be so consistently that he creates opportunities that other mid laners just don't create in the LEC. He is the smartest player, I would argue, in the region, or certainly one of the smartest players in the region. His teams are constantly near the top of the league in terms of late game macro decisions, regardless of who else is on the team, and he's able to late game teamfight carry anything. He's still phenomenal in lane. He still is able to generate a lot of advantages for himself, but that's really where he separates himself. He is a late game monster, and that carries over into playing something like Smolder. Again, this was not the easiest game in the world for Smolder. It became the easiest game in the world for Smolder, but looking at the enemy composition, there are a lot of ways for this dragon to be in trouble throughout the game. He just did a really good job of being able to avoid it, and honestly, he made it look effortless here on the Smolder, which is even more impressive. But again, big shout out to Broken Blade. He was the other player that I think was truly, truly excellent in this game. It's those two. Like, those two are G2, regardless of what's happening with jungle and support right now, where both of them are really still trying to find their footing on a new team. And, you know, Hansama's just never going to be that primary option type of guy. I think he could be, especially in, like, best of 3s and best of 5s, where these series are going a bit longer. Caps and Broken Blade are the faces of G2. They are the carries of G2, and they're the reason this team even has 2 wins up until this point in this split already. So, big ups to them. But done of the series is, or done of the game is once again going to stay on the winning side. I promise I really don't do this all that frequently. I know you can't really believe that because you've seen it twice now in a row, but this is not the same circumstance as KOI versus GX, where I gave Elyoya dead of the game because, you know, everybody was really good and he was the only one to make any mistakes. No, Skumond was actually kind of bad in this game. He's going to get dead of the game for me. I get that there are some things you can excuse on the brand. He did a good job pathing in the early game, but this guy's smite key does not work. Like, I get that it's hard to, you know, smite fight against Maokai. You know, it's one of the easier champions, I would say, to consistently get 50-50s on, but why are we setting up for so many 50-50s? Part of that goes on Labrav, who I will talk about in just a second, but Skumond is another rookie that feels like he's having trouble adapting to this level. We've already talked a bit about the BDS rookies, and, you know, we've seen it with Paris, his teammate, his former teammate here in Skumond. like, they're just not playing well at the start of their LEC tenure. Hopefully they can grow into something more, but these rookies have definitely taken more time, I would say, to adapt than we are used to seeing out of rookies coming up from the ERLs that did as well as these players did. Labrov, like I said, was also not particularly great in this game. He just doesn't really have objective setups in the same kind of way that he did on BDS. Again, I think it's a communication thing. That's what I would imagine. Like, a lot of this will probably be solved when this team gets a little bit better in terms of how they want to set up these objectives. It's still very early on in the year, and it does feel like synergy is holding them back to an extent, but Labrov was kind of brought in to be that primary voice, and it doesn't really feel like he's doing that right now. So don't really know what the reason is for that, but their objective setups are horrible. Labrov continues to go in without the rest of his team at times, and Skewmon just continues to let the enemy basically have free reign on a lot of these like mid-game prio objectives, which I just don't really like as a strategy for G2. I get that they're going to be focused a lot more on playing team fights in the later half of the game, because I do think that's where a lot of their talent level ends up indexing, but outside of like being able to win 5v5s, you still need to have proper setups for a lot of these things, and it feels like they don't really have that right now. And then for Vitality on the other side, they played fine. I'm certainly not going to criticize them too heavily. G2 is a good team, and Caps was excellent. Broken Blade was excellent. They kind of had to go up against two of the best players in the entire league, and, you know, unfortunately, they just didn't have the firepower. First player I want to point out is actually Nako on the top side. He has not been like the other rookies that have struggled. He has come in and immediately been a huge positive for them. I know that the scoreline doesn't look great, but those Rumble ultimates were really, really crucial at keeping this game alive for most of the mid game. So credit to him. Again, Broken Blade played well, but Nako was still a very relevant threat, and in my opinion, the best player on Vitality in this game. And then Carzzy and Hilly, you know, their scorelines look great. They got there in the most Carzzy Hilly way possible, where both of them made some, you know, pretty awful errors in the middle of this game that kind of put Vitality really far behind. But at the end of the day, they were able to recover and recuperate and, you know, get back on track. Hilly almost made a game-winning play on the rel. Carzzy was flashing in every which way, and every single major move that they made throughout the game made me go, oh my god, what is happening? And yet they still were able to get away with a lot of it because they are talented. They're not going to be a particularly consistent bot lane because of that, but, you know, they tried their best here. I just don't think the middle of the map was all that great. Linsas, Chayak, if you wanted to give one of them dead of the game, I could totally understand that. Chayak was barely relevant at all in this one on the Corki, a champion we've actually seen do really well here in the LEC. And Linsas, you know, credit to him, he was pretty active on the Maokai, and I do think he had more of an impact on the game than someone like Skewmon did, even if he did die a little bit more. Obviously, getting those smites were huge, but, you know, being able to help out the Jhin and the Rumble, be able to get ahead, that was also something that I don't think got a lot of credit from Linsas. I'm not the biggest fan of his game at the current moment. I still think he is a little bit too, you know, passive in the mid game for my liking, but this was an okay performance, and I would argue he was the better jungler between these two players. Vitality has things to build on. Nako's good. Like, he's actually good. He's going to be a player who's, like, borderline top half, top laner, basically right now from day one, and Carzzy and Hilly can win any game. Chayak has shown good things. Linsas has shown good things. Like, this team is going to be sitting around 6 or 7, but G2 should be better than them, and they were in this game. They had the two best players. They just need to clean up a lot of their setups, because right now it does feel like this is a very talented team with good players that has basically no synergy. Then moving on to our 5th game of day number 1, our 5th and final one, and we finally have a sub 25-minute blowout. It's Corp taking on SK Gaming, and Corp absolutely obliterated them. This was not a particularly close game, not even really all that much to analyze in terms of what actually happened on the Rift. This was an expected outcome. Like, SK looks like an absolute disaster. They are clearly the worst team in the LEC at the current moment. Shout out Rahel, who is trying his best to do anything on this lineup and on this roster. Even Isma, I think, is starting to do something in the early game. He's trying to get back to that form that he was in winter of last year, but the solo lanes are a disaster. Support feels like a major downgrade at the current moment, and everything's just kind of going wrong for SK. And then for Corp, it's kind of the opposite. Everything that could go right for this team is kind of going right now. Yike looks excellent. He looks just as good as he did on G2, if not even a little bit better here at the start of this split. Kana looks like he's starting to get some of that LCK form back, and this bot lane is like super for real. Targamas has like completely turned himself back around to that G2 version of himself, and Kalist he's awesome from day number 1. I know a lot of people expected it, even I kind of expected that he would be good from day number 1, but he's not been good. He has been excellent from day number 1. So Let's get into it. Yike is player of the game here on the Zyra. Really great stuff from him. Isma actually did try to do things in the early game on this Edge 20. Yike was just a little bit better than him. He was everywhere on this map, like legitimately everywhere on this map. This was truly an exceptional jungle performance, and I do think he's going to get a bit undersold. Kaliste got player of the game on the broadcast or the fan voted poll. I get it. Like, Kaliste was a really, really big difference maker in terms of the damage on the Draven, but I think all of the setup was Yike throughout this entire game. A lot of the seed planting for the Draven to be so aggressive and to be so good in this game was done by Yike, and as good as Kaliste was, Yike was definitely the guy that was setting everything up and really laying the groundwork for the rest of this team to be able to capitalize, and that was with his competition still doing well on the other side. The other player that I think played really well here, Kana on the top side. This was an excellent performance from him on the Gragas. You know, GIANTX isn't obviously like crazy competition at the current moment in terms of the form that he's actually in. He's playing really bad. So is Reeker in the mid lane. It's just not working out for the solo lanes on SK, but Kana still had to be able to go out and execute on that. He's mostly been weak side here in the LEC, been asked to 1v1 quite a bit, and hasn't necessarily been all that dominant in the 1v1s that he has actually taken. It's nice to see that the form, at least mechanically right now, is better than what it was at the end of 2024 when he came in. I really do think he can be, you know, a top 2, top 3 top laner. I'm not exactly sure if he's guaranteed to be there right now with how well some of the other players in that role are playing, but he is definitely somebody that should be able to push K-Corp forward, and, you know, him upgrading even over 2024, I think, is a massive positive. Already said it, but Kaliste and Targamas were excellent. Kaliste did a great job of being the primary carry in terms of damage throughout a lot of this game. Again, I understand why, you know, people voted for him for player of the game. I just think people are underrating how good Yike was, not overrating how good Kaliste was. Kaliste was excellent. He was better than Rahel, who is a very good AD carry on the other side of this. Targamas has really stabilized for this team. He's gone from being the worst player in the LEC over the last 2 years to somebody that has actually just been nothing but a positive so far at the start of this split, even in their loss. It's really good stuff. Like, K-Corp is legit. This is a team that's very much at the top of the standings that will be competing for top, 2, top 3, like somewhere in that zone. Like top 5 is all kind of scary in the LEC right now, assuming everything ends up going well for teams like G2. K-Corp has very much proven that. And then for SK, this team is a disaster. There's honestly not much that I can say that I didn't already say in week number 1. The solo lanes are awful. Reeker is like completely he's a non-factor. Like Vladi wasn't even a main character on the Corki in this one, and the Yone was still really, really poor, just didn't really participate in anything, and GIANTX was horrible. He's gonna get dead of the game here on the Rumble. Like, Kana completely outplayed him, and yeah, Kana's like started to level up. He's played a lot better than he did at the end of last year, but like this is just not great. Like, this is a really, really bad look for GIANTX, a player who played really well in the LFL. Again, a lot of these promoted players are not doing particularly well. These players that are coming up from the ERLs, it's been a really rough road for them so far at the start of 2025, and that is encapsulated by far the most by SK Gaming, who was really relying on these two coming in from BDS Academy and really being positives, and they have been anything but. It's not been good for GIANTX and Reeker. Rahel and Isma were fine, I guess. Isma's scoreline is probably better than his gameplay would indicate. Rahel was the best player on the team here. He was genuinely the only one attempting to do anything to try to win this game, but you have to blame him for bringing Loopy in. Like, Loopy looks like a gigantic downgrade from Luan. I got a lot of pushback when I said that, there was no reason for them to get rid of Luan and to bring Loopy in. People were like, they played so well on DK Challengers, and, Loopy is obviously a player that Rahel wanted to play with, and maybe that would end up working out, but Loopy wasn't very good in the LLA last year. I mean, he was fine. He was like an average LLA support, but expecting that guy to come in and be better than Luan, who was actually really good for this team down the stretch, it just felt like a major, major leap, and lo and behold, it hasn't happened. Loopy has been a downgrade in the support position. Mid is awful, top is awful, support feels like one of the weaker in the league. Isma's not exactly like a superstar in the jungle. Best case scenario, he's a slightly below average jungler, and Rahel is just kind of mega stuck. This is the worst team in the LEC, and it's not close. K-Corp is really, really good though, and a 22.5-minute win is pretty gigantic for this team. Sitting at 3-1 is a really nice place to be. It feels like everything that you could have hoped for from this organization is kind of coming to fruition at the start of this split. Yike looks excellent, and Kaliste looks excellent. Those were the two players you kind of really needed to rely on the most, and both of them are on like borderline MVP pace right now. But then moving on now to the start of day number 2, and it's a pretty decent start, I would say, in terms of fun games. It's GIANTX taking on Team Heretics, and GIANTX is going to pick up the win here with how they have played at the start of this split. This should not be a surprise to anybody. This is a genuinely very good team, and Heretics, to their credit, is competitive in certain ways, but they're not going to be on the same level as these upper tier teams. Top 5 feel very disconnected from the rest of the LEC at the current moment, and GIANTX has very much put themselves in that conversation. And I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that everybody on the team is playing well. At the current moment, it feels like they've gotten really good individual performances out of everybody on the team, and it does feel like they have good synergy together as well, but you're really getting these emerging, like, star-making performances from a couple of players in particular. There are two that I think really stood out in this game for me. Player of the game is going to go to Jackie's for me. He is the guy, like, he is the face of the franchise for GIANTX. Obviously, they kept him in the offseason. There were a lot of rumors, we'll just say, about him going to a bigger team like Fnatic or, you know, one of these other organizations that probably would be a little bit more prestigious to play on, but GIANTX had Jackie's under contract. He signed that 2-year deal at the beginning of last year, and they were like, no, we're going to keep him. We're going to be trying to contend as much as we can this year, and you know what? It's absolutely worked out for them. Jackie's is developing into a superstar very quickly. Already talked about it earlier this week, but Kamalu is certainly not the kind of player that's going to be able to stop Jackie's trajectory that he is currently on. It's funny because I think Kamalu is kind of Team Heretics' attempt to get a version of Jackie's from last year, taking a big punt on a player who wasn't necessarily as proven as other players because they saw some potential in his mechanics. Kamalu has obviously struggled a bit at the start of his LEC tenure, but Jackie's has been exceptionally good for GIANTX at the start of 2025. The other player to shout out here is Noah in the AD carry role. This bot lane has been phenomenal at the start of this year. I know a lot of Fnatic fans wanted to blame Noah and wanted to blame Jun for things going wrong. I know a lot of Fnatic fans also liked Noah and Jun. I know it's a bit more of a split. We got a lot of Noah defenders in my comments last year, and so I'm not trying to make too many general statements on that, but it's really, really nice to see these two leave Fnatic and still be able to keep up that same kind of pace. I talked about it this offseason, but one thing that I think really did help out Noah and Jun is that they're going to a team that didn't really have a ton of expectations. Noah in particular has been very vocal about how he struggled with a lot of the pressure that was put on him for playing for Fnatic. That's something that just doesn't exist for GIANTX. There really weren't those same kinds of expectations, and they've been able to come out here and just kind of play their own game. Flacket and Stend, as we talked about earlier this week, are not the worst bot lane by any means. Flacket's a very good player, and I think Stend is fine as a support basically from day one, but Noah and Jun are probably playing as the most consistent bot lane in the LEC at the current moment, which is a big positive. Jackie's and Noah definitely the carries of this game, both of them looking excellent. And again, Lot. I think Lot's been the other, like, major positive surprise for me at the start of this split. Not that I'm, like, shocked that he's good, but he's a really good carry. Like, he can do a lot in team fights. Now, he was a lot lower resource in this game in particular, and so maybe this is a bad game to, you know, give my example, but he's been given a lot of responsibility early on for this team, and he's really come up clutch, I would say, in every opportunity to do that. Closer's been good at the start, was definitely better than Sheo. Like I said, Jun was probably the single best player in the entire league in week number 1, and so everything really is clicking for GIANTX. This does feel like a guaranteed top 5 team. We'll see if they can break through and be a top 3 or top 4 team. There's a lot going on right now in the LEC that makes it difficult to project moving forward, but GIANTX is certainly a team you have to watch out for and a team that very much could make some noise in the playoffs. And then for Heretics on the other side, this is, you know, exactly what they are. Like, this is a perfect encapsulation, I think, of who Team Heretics will be in 2025. Flacket and Stend, I think, are good. They're solid, but they're probably not going to be the best bot lane in the entire league or anything like that. And then the rest of this roster is just mega inconsistent. Sheo, I think, is fine, but really needs early game leads in order to express the kind of mid-game dominance that he was able to show on BDS for quite a while. He doesn't have the same kind of winning lanes on this team, which I think that's definitely hurt him at the start of this year. He's definitely not quite as comfortable playing with, you know, rookie solo laners, but it is those rookie solo laners that are going to be a little bit more up in the air. It's kind of similar to SK in that regard. I just think their bot lane is better, their jungle is better, and honestly, their solo lanes are probably better, even if they are still struggling. Kamalu is going to get yet another dud of the game. This is his third in their 3 losses. Not really an ideal set of circumstances for him when they lose, or when he loses specifically. He loses very hard, it would seem. You know, we didn't really know what we were going to get out of him as a player in year number 1 because he is coming from the LFL Tier 2, essentially a Tier 3 region down in France, and obviously there's a lot that comes with that. He wasn't exactly dominant in that league either. I didn't project him to be good from day one. He's shown flashes, I think, when this team is doing well outside of him, when Flacket and Stend are winning super hard, or when Sheo has pressure in the jungle. I do think he does play a little bit better, and the mechanics are there. He doesn't feel like a superstar in the same way that Jackie's was kind of emerging in the winter split, but he doesn't feel like a disaster if things are going well around him. He's just going to look really bad if the rest of the team isn't winning. Like, if they don't have prio or pressure, he's going to get absolutely exposed in the middle of the map. He has no idea how to play from behind, at least at this level, and so Kamalu kind of being, unfortunately, exactly what we thought he was going to be, a project, we'll just say, in the mid lane. And then Carlson had a pretty good game earlier this week. Not so much here. Not that he was like a disaster or anything, but Lot was definitely better and is certainly the better promotion here on the top side of the map so far at the beginning of 2025. Team Heretics is fine. Like, they're going to be a bottom 3 or a bottom 4 team. They just don't really have the talent to move above that. They're going to be a tough out. They still put up a fight in this one, but GX is just better, and Jackies and Noah are just really, really strong as a carry duo. Jun looks like one of the best supports in the entire league. Lot actually looks like one of the best top laners in the entire league right now. Closer's been very consistent in the jungle. GX is a genuine threat sitting at 4-1, and I'm really glad to see that. Then moving on to our second game of the second day, and it's a battle of two teams that have struggled to come out of the gate. It's SK Gaming taking on Team Vitality, but one of these teams is definitely not like the other. Vitality picks up a win here. SK is just a disaster, like an unmitigated disaster. This is one of the worst teams we have seen at the LEC level in quite a long time. Their solo lane duo is just completely inept. It's like Rogue and Corp from last year rolled into one, where they're super slow, super passive, not really doing much in the early game, even though they have pieces to be able to do that, with players like Isma, generally being a very good early game jungler, and Rahel generally being a very good 2v2 bot laner. They're just slowed down so much by the fact that they don't trust themselves to be able to win individually, and then add that onto what Corp had as a problem last year, which is just that their solo laners are not good enough to be playing at this level, clearly are just not ready to be able to make that transition from tier 2 to tier 1, and all of a sudden you get this team that has no business really being in any of these games. They were like relatively playable in this one, which I'll talk about. Again, Rahel is really good, and Isma continues to not be an absolute disaster for this team, but most of Vitality's ability to win this game at all came through SK just throwing it away. This should have been an SK win, really, under any circumstance, and they just had the 2, maybe 3 worst players on the Rift, if you really want to put Reeker in that conversation. But for Vitality, at least a win is a win. Like, at least it's a win. I don't think they played particularly well in this game. I think they made a ton of mistakes. They're super flippy in a lot of specific areas, and the score lines, I think, do kind of indicate that to an extent, but there are some things to talk about. Player of the game was kind of difficult, because I think if I were going off of the highlights in my head or the moments that I remember, I actually might give this to Nako on the top side, who continues to really impress me. Him and Lot are both fighting it out for being the best promotion on the top side so far. Both of them, I think, have been very good for their individual teams, but I am going to give it to Carzzy. He was more consistent throughout the entire game. He certainly interacted with quite a bit more of the game, and as much as I, criticize Carzzy, I do think that there is like a lot of upside to him when things go right, or especially when the enemy team just kind of gives him free resources. He is very good at punishing people when they are out of position. He is very good at playing aggressive. The problem is sometimes that does come with a bit of a drawback. Now, we saw that drawback in the form of Hylissang throughout a lot of this game. That dive in the bot lane was just an absolute disaster for the Braum. Hylissang plays a couple of these moments incredibly poorly, but he was still very valuable at the end of this game to be able to protect the Varus and the Azir and be able to set up for the Gragas to actually do a lot of the big, moments in a lot of these team fights. But man, Hilly can be very flippy. Still want to give credit to Carzzy. He's had a pretty good start to the year. He's been inconsistent in the sense that he still does a lot of these hyper-aggressive things. He's not been punished as hard as he has been in previous splits. I don't think his gameplay has really changed all that much. I think it's more so just the way teams are adapting to him. But in terms of results and performances, he's been pretty good to start this split, which is good. A lot of AD carries have been good, and Carzzy's definitely necessary for Vitality to be like a relevant team in the standings. But Nako, man, like, he's the guy I'm really watching on this team. Maybe Carzzy fans are going to come for me in the comments section for saying that, but like, the star of this team in my eyes is Nako right now. He's so fun to watch. He's doing so many cool things on the top side. Again, if he had a little bit more of a consistent game across this entire 31 minutes, then I probably would have given him player of the game. And honestly, you could make a really strong argument to still give it to him, even with, the things going wrong for him in the beginning here. But generally, I'm just really impressed with the way his mechanics have translated. He really is able to completely outplay a lot of other top laners. Once again, it's GIANTX, and so I'm not going to put too much stock into it because he's not a particularly dominant player right now. We'll get into that, but it's still a good look. Nako has looked great. Linsas looked solid here. Chayak going deathless is really, really good. Like, Vitality in general kind of giving you what you needed to see here. I want to see a little bit more aggressiveness in the mid game. Their mid game was a disaster in this one. SK actually did a good job of being able to generate a lead. They just did absolutely nothing with it in the late game, and they ended up losing because they suck, and Vitality is going to be lucky to walk away with a win in that regard, but there is still things to compliment when it comes to Vitality in this game. But for SK on the other side, I don't know what to tell you, man. This team is like garbage, like actually just garbage. They're going to be the worst team in any major region, maybe outside of Team WE. Like, I don't know. There's not going to be a North American team that's as bad as SK is. This team is just completely incompetent. And I feel so bad for Rahel because he actually is playing really well here. This was a great game from him once again. His support continues to completely troll away a lot of the leads that he's able to generate. Do not play elite support in the LEC. We barely see this work in the LCK. In fact, we see this not go well more often than not in the LCK. With better players playing it, you're not going to be able to get away with this in the LEC. It just isn't working out. Loopy was awful here. Isma also continues to have like decent mid games. Like, this was a pretty good mid game, all things considered, for him. I don't think he's really been all that bad this split. It's just the solo lanes and support that have been a nightmare. Like, Reeker does nothing this entire game. I'm not blaming him for this one. He had significantly worse games in week number 1 than he did here. But GIANTX gets his one trick on the Jace, the champion he's by far the most famous for, and does literally nothing all game. Is not particularly good, does not even really try to contest the Gragas in terms of the way things are going, and then just completely falls apart in the later half. Like, I'm out on GIANTX. I wanted to be so excited for him because this tape in the LFL was really good. He was arguably the best top laner in the LFL. Dude was dominating a lot of games. He came into BDS during their playoff run last year and actually looked pretty okay, like when he was replacing Adam. It's just all falling apart. I don't know if it's because SK is a disaster or if it's just like GIANTX not being as good as we thought he was. Like, I really don't know what it is, but going up against Nako and just being so bad on your main champion, like, it's not good. He looks like the worst player in the league right now. And then, like I said, Loopy was the other player that I think really stood out as just being really bad in this game, and he's been really bad at the start of this split. Even with Rahel individually playing well and Isma trying to get leads for him in the bot lane, his support is like genuinely bottom 1 or bottom 2 in the entire league. SK is just a disaster everywhere. They're 0-5. They're going to be begging for a win or two. It's pretty much guaranteed that this is going to be one of the bottom 2 teams coming out of the regular season that will not be making the best of 3 stage, and, you know, SK kind of deserves that for how they've played here. But for Vitality on the other side, like, they look okay. I don't think this is a world-beating type of team. They should have performed better in this game. SK gave them basically a free win, and it still took them a bit of time to be able to take it from them. Hylissang needs to clean up some of the mistakes, but if he did, it wouldn't be Hylissang, and so not much to say there. Nako needs to get more involved because the guy is winning every single time he's actually getting himself in there, and I would love to see Linsas and Chayak be more than just pieces on this team. Like, I want to see them actually take some more aggressive roles, but Vitality picking up a win here hopefully is the start of them gaining that kind of confidence. Then moving on to our third game of day number 2. This is our middle game of the week and kind of the middle game of the split. And it's a good one. It's the historic rivalry in the LEC. It's Fnatic taking on G2. And Fnatic is going to pick up a really, really big victory for themselves here. G2 is going to move to below 500 again here after starting the week 1 and 2. Things are really going wrong for this roster right now. It feels like they are not a particularly well-rounded team at the current moment, and honestly, this is where I start to get concerned. It's not them losing a couple of games in week number 1, because they've done that before. They've started off 1 and 2, and things have not necessarily looked all that good, but there's something different about this team. The communication, the synergy, it's just not there. They rely too much on one player. And for Fnatic, this is a gigantic win. They played really well in this game. This was very clean, very clinical. This felt like international Fnatic rather than domestic Fnatic, which is a really good sign. This was kind of a hurdle that they really couldn't overcome for a lot of last year. And so for this team to be able to show up here in their first matchup against G2 and kind of just be better than them across the entire game, pretty fantastic stuff. Player of the game is obviously going to go to Humanoid. I don't really know how you could give it to anybody else in this instance. He was spectacular on the Azir. He has performances like this every so often. It's never really been about the good performances with Humanoid. It's always been about the bad ones. This was a really good one. There's no other way to say it other than he completely outplayed Caps. Like, he gapped Caps in this series, and that's pretty insane, or in this game, and that's a really, really big thing to see for Fnatic, because as long as Humanoid can be a positive for this team, and as long as he is going out there and actually trying and locking in and not, you know, having these mental breakdowns in the middle of a game where he just, like, forgets that he needs to play safe in certain situations, he's, like, mechanically speaking, right up there with Caps and with Jojo Pune and with the best mid laners in the entire league, and certainly the best mid laners in the West. Like, we know what Humanoid looks like at his best, and this was it. Azir is obviously kind of the signature champ. I think he had a lot of setup this game to be able to make it a lot easier for him. Things like the Maokai plus Leona do make it a lot easier for Azir to be able to take over in the mid game, and that's exactly what he did. Great game from Humanoid. I do want to give a big shout out to both Upset and Mickey X, so I think both played really well here. Upset playing super aggro on the Ezreal, just eing forward and, you know, flashing forward in certain instances to try and make sure that he's capitalizing on things. It seems like he's taken a lot of the criticism from not only last year, but the last couple of years to heart, where he's like, I just haven't been playing aggressive enough. I know I'm talented. I know I have the mechanics. I have to trust that I can outplay a lot of the people here. That's what a lot of the other AD carries do in this league. And you know what? He was able to outplay not only Hansama, but, you know, Caps and Broken Blade and a lot of these other champions that were supposed to be able to punish that Ezreal in the later half of the game. Credit to Upset. Mickey X continues to look very good. This must be a very, very exciting win for him over G2. Always good to get a win over your former org. Big mental shout out to Oscar Rinnan. Give him 5x honors at the end of this game, because dude was dove on the top side over and over and over again on the Jace. He was put so far behind and yet was still so useful in the back half of this game. Funny to talk about this coming off of GIANTX's Jace game with how useless he was, even with mid-game resources. Like, Oscar was taken completely out of this one and was still pretty useful on the top side, so credit to him. Razork was really good on the Maokai, definitely outplayed Skewmond. Like, Fnatic just looked great in this one. They were definitely the better of these two teams, which is very encouraging. And for G2, man, a lot's going wrong here. It really is Caps or bust, isn't it? Like, Caps played bad in this game. He's going to get done of the game, as you can see on the Sylas. Even though he was trying a lot of things, it felt like they just weren't really landing. Like, Humanoid was outplaying him in this game, and that happens every so often. Caps is not a perfect player. He's just an important player for G2, but what we are seeing is that if Caps is not carrying games for G2, they don't win. Like, they are not going to be in contention. Now, that's still a pretty wide net for a win condition, right? Caps can beat anybody in the league pretty consistently. Like, I would still consider him the best player in the LEC, but if he is going to have a game like this where he's not, like, on fire and, like, absolutely dominating Humanoid, nobody else on this team is going to pick up the slack. Broken Blade was given a ton of resources in this game, especially because Oscar Rinnan was so far behind, and he still wasn't particularly useful in the back half. That's not good. Hansama is just, like, a nothing burger right now in the bot lane. He's existing, and he's not really making mistakes, but he's not pushing this team forward in any conceivable way. He's just along for the ride with whatever else is happening with G2. Some of that is him not having great synergy with Labrov, which we talked about in the primer, but Labrov didn't even play bad this game. He wasn't making gigantic mistakes. I am concerned about Skewmond. Like, this guy is just not particularly good for G2 right now. Maybe things get better, but this is not like when Yike joined G2 and, you know, things weren't necessarily super cohesive. Like, Caps was having to play Sejuani and Zac in the mid lane in order to make room for Yike, but they were still figuring it out, right? And they eventually very quickly got to the point where they could play multiple different things, where Yike felt a little bit more integrated. They're not playing for Skewmond in that same kind of way, and he's really struggling. Like, he is not playing well at the current moment. He's gonna have to be better. I think him and Labrov have both not necessarily been good signings so far for G2. Even if Labrov is playing better here in week 2 than he did in week 1, Hansama is a complete non-factor, and like I said, Broken Blade needs to do more with these resources. If Caps is like the only player who can win a game on this team, G2 is not going to win the league. Hell, they might not even be top 3 if Caps is the only player who can win a game. I still think it's a pretty wide net. Again, if you're relying on Caps to win games for you, he's gonna do that, but in this case, it just didn't happen, and for Fnatic, they took advantage of that. Humanoid was excellent and just outplayed Caps, and that was a death sentence for G2. Oscar survived a ton of pressure on the top side. Upset's looking even more aggressive. Razork has very much carried over his form from last year. Fnatic's legit. They genuinely look like a very good team right now, and honestly, what's stopping them from being the best team in the LEC? Then moving on to our 4th game of day number 2, and yet another dominant performance for K-Corp. It's them taking on Rogue, and they obliterate Rogue once again. That's 2 games this week that K-Corp have just utterly dominated. In both games, they've looked absolutely unstoppable, and quite frankly, both games were really, really similar for them. Both of them were run through Kaliste on the Draven, really kind of getting him into a position where he could take over and carry, and, you know, Yike really doing a lot of that facilitation early on, and then kind of relying on Kana to be able to be that secondary option for them. Now, Kana was much more than a secondary option in this one, but how do you not shout out Kaliste, who is a very easy choice for player of the game? If it wasn't very clear that this guy is mechanically better than the people he's going up against right now, I think this game kind of solidified that, proved that to a staggering extent, if you will. Patrick just does not have the mechanics that Kaliste has. Go watch that 2v1 in the mid lane. Absolutely ridiculous from Kaliste. He really is everything that people were hyping him up to be, and then some. There's still some concerns, I think, to me about what happens when he goes up against AD carries, that he can't just out-mechanic and out-skill, but right now this team is doing such a fantastic job of, I don't want to say hiding his weaknesses, because it's not like the weaknesses are even like a consideration for the team right now, but getting him into these positions where he can take over games. Yike is doing such a good job in the early game at being able to establish tempo and pressure for KC that Khalees's job is just so simple. It's go out there and outplay the opponents, and he can do that. He's got the mechanical ceiling to be able to do that. If you want a rookie that's coming out and looking phenomenal day number one, Khalees is absolutely that guy. But I think kind of a hidden part of that formula is just how good Targamas has been so far. I'm not going to say that Khalees is the support whisperer or anything like that, because I do think it's much more dynamic than something like that, but Targamas has been one of the worst players in the entire league the last 2 years, ever since leaving G2. Khalees comes in and all of a sudden he's like back into that G2 form. Pretty crazy. These two obviously have had synergy together from previous years playing together in the ERLs, you know, in the K-Corp system. It was the reason Targamas was on this team at all to begin with, is because Khalees kind of chose him as his hand-picked support to play with, and you know what? It's absolutely working out right now. Targamas has really been excellent as an engaged threat throughout the entirety of this split so far. I mean, we got 3 funny Jace games in a row. We got the Jace performance from GIANTX that looked horrible, the Jace performance from Oscarinin where he got mega dove and never really got to play the game, and now the dominant Korean Jace performance from Kana in the top lane. I think 99% of games Kana gets player of the game for this kind of Jace performance. It's just Khalees had that crazy outplay in the mid lane, and then obviously was kind of the primary damage dealer in a lot of the late game fights, and that led me to, you know, putting him as player of the game. But Kana played out of his mind here. Again, he started off 2025 significantly better than he ended 2024, and that's a really good sign for K-Corp. Maybe him getting a lot more comfortable not only playing with these teammates, but playing in Europe was, you know, kind of the reason for it. Maybe he just needed to adapt to the new environment, but whatever it is, he has been excellent so far at the start of this split. Of course, Yike has been dominant. He's like on, you know, MVP frontrunner type of pace. He was excellent in winter last year. He might be even better right now for K-Corp. And somehow, some way, Vladdy's like the one player I haven't mentioned. He's been there. He's been along for the ride. It's not like he's losing at all in the mid lane. He's doing just fine for himself. But everybody else is taking so much of the spotlight, it's hard to be able to steal it at the current moment. Great stuff from K-Corp. And, you know, Rogue did not look good in this one. There's really no other way to say it. Like, this team is kind of the opposite of what we've talked about with the team like SK Gaming, where, you know, Rahel is kind of the one that's keeping them in it, and everybody else you just kind of struggle to find a place for. Patrick is like single-handedly losing this team so many games. He's gonna get dud of the game again. His mechanics are cooked. Like, I don't really know what else to tell you. He looks pretty cooked out there. Hopefully that doesn't end up being the case for like a super long period of time. Honestly, if Rogue ends up bottom 2 here, I'm probably looking at a replacement in the AD carry role, because Patrick's downward trajectory has been pretty consistent. I wouldn't really expect things to get better as we continue to go throughout the year, but it's not just Patrick. I would love to sit here and say that Patrick is the worst player in the LEC, but it really isn't entirely him. Execute has also not been very good for this team. He's showing a lot of the flaws that he showed in the LCK last year. People were expecting him to come in and be that version of Jonghoon that was on Astralis a couple of years ago. It's a very, very different player coming back from the Fearex system and from the LCK in general. Last year, he was not good. He got benched, and that team got way better after he was gone. We're seeing that version of Execute. Malrang is not really able to keep up, but he's not the problem. Larson is just way too slow. Dude is doing literally nothing on the map. This is 2024 Larson personified, and Adam is not exactly dominating on the top side either. Rogue doesn't look particularly good. Obviously, their win over Heretics does inspire some confidence that this team can be not bottom 2. All they need to do is get into the top 8, and they're already better than what they were last year, but, you know, bottom 2 does seem like a realistic outcome for Rogue, and that's not entirely surprising, but definitely disappointing. And then for K-Corp, this team is excellent. They're going to be competing for top 1 or top 2. That's where we're at. Again, top 5, maybe top 4 if you don't like G2 right now. They all feel really, really strong. K-Corp is very much a part of that mix, and nobody's been more dominant across week 2 so far. And then moving on to our 5th game of the second day, our end of day 2, and it's another pretty big blowout, I would say, all things considered, but not a surprising one. Team BDS taking on Movistar KOI, and KOI is going to pick up yet another victory. Again, a lot of these top-tier teams just building their resumes at this point. Basically, all of them have a little bit of a circle right now. All of them have beaten one of the other, you know, top members. They've all lost to one of the other top members, and they're all really sitting at 4-1, and it very much feels clear who has kind of emerged emerged at the start of this year as favorites, and KOI is definitely a part of that. BDS very much not a part of that. They're actually kind of suffering a very similar fate to G2 right now. I just don't have as much faith that they're going to be able to bounce back from that as I do with G2. I think BDS was supposed to be a team that I was really excited about going into this year, but things are just falling apart for them. There's not really a lot of good to talk about when it comes to how BDS is playing. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the game for me for KOI is pretty obviously going to go to Mirwin on the top side. You know, I've been very critical of Mirwin on this channel. I was very critical of him last year. It felt like he was either playing K'Sante or he was playing a ranged top laner, and there was absolutely nothing else. Even the K'Sante at times looked kind of bad from him. It just didn't feel all that consistent unless he was pulling out something crazy off meta. Obviously, when he did that, things ended up working out for him, whether it was the Smolder or the, you know, the Varus or the Twisted Fate when that, you know, was before it was kind of popularized, we'll say at the beginning of winter last year. Mirwin was super inconsistent on everything else, and so to see him pick up a second melee champion that he can actually be good on here in the Ambessa is very, very positive. I think last year a lot of teams were just drafting K'Sante and then forcing Mirwin to do something else into that. Now it feels like you have to take away both the K'Sante and the Ambessa. Should be something that teams do adapt to, and so we'll see what happens with Mirwin, but the Ambessa looks pretty phenomenal. He was really able to take over this game in a way that we haven't seen from a lot of other Ambessa players in the LEC so far. Really good stuff from him. He has only played 2 champions through their first 5 games, but we'll see if that ends up improving. The rest of the team was still really good. Elyoya continues to be awesome. This bot lane is exceptionally good. Supa and Alvaro are very solid. If Noah and Jun weren't taking so many of the headlines right now in terms of like bot lane performances, Supa and Alvaro might be the best performing bot lane in the LEC. They genuinely have been that good at the start of 2025. And JoJo, despite the scoreline, was super influential on the positive success rate of the team in this game. Again, Elyoya is going to get a little bit more praise than JoJo because of the stat line, but JoJo was very, very important towards this win for KOI. Overall, they're just a very well-balanced team. I just really like the way this team is constructed. As long as JoJo's playing well in the mid lane, I think this team is going to be one of the best in the entire region. And again, very similar to what we said about Corp and about GIANTX and, you know, about Fnatic. Like, they're going to compete for top 1 in the state that they're currently in right now. But for BDS on the other side, things are just going wrong for this team. I was excited for 113. It felt like the advancements that he made on Corp Blue last year in the LFL were real, and it felt like he, you know, was promoted too soon to the LEC, went back down to the LFL, got his bearings, you know, got readjusted, and, you know, actually deserved the call-up this time. That's not really kind of translated at all. I was excited to see what he could be at this level, and all he has been is a disaster. Quite frankly, Elyoya completely outplayed him here. And again, Elyoya, KOI, like, it's a tough opponent. It's not exactly an easy matchup here for BDS, but this has become a trend. 113 has just not been good at all at the start of this split. He's been one of the weaker junglers, if not like the weakest jungler in the entire league to start off 2025. He's certainly within the conversation, which is never really an ideal place to be. He doesn't really seem to feel all that comfortable on a lot of these setup champions. He was known a little bit more for his carry performances in the LFL. I hope to see them maybe try that at the very least. Like, Nuke is more than willing to sacrifice some of his early game pressure to allow his jungler to be a little bit more main character-y. We've seen that in the past, and Ice is certainly not like a focal point in the early game. I think 113 does need to start getting some confidence boosts here, or else he's just going to continue to play the way that he did on Astralis, which is a below average, a significantly below average facilitating type of jungler. It's just not really the style that I like for him, and he continues to get exposed in that role. Paris also has not been good at the start of this split. I don't really know what to say when it comes to Paris. This is just not the same version of the player that we saw in the LFL or we saw in EU Masters. Like, it's just not the same guy. I think it's got to be a confidence thing. It's got to be a trust thing with the rest of this team. He was very active as a support in the LFL and, you know, in EU Masters and the ERLs in general. He has been a player that I've watched for quite a long time, even going back before this past year on BDS Academy. Like, he has been somebody that I've hyped up, you know, for years and years and years because his tape has been so good, and he gets here to the LEC and he just plays like a completely different player. Again, a lot of that can be circumstance. We're seeing that with Targamas doing really well on another team, but we've got to start to see some improvement because it's the new players on this team that are dragging them down. Irrelevant got completely outplayed by Mirwin in the K'Sante versus Ambessa matchup. Nuke and Ice probably had their weakest games in a while. Nuke's been pretty good at the start of this split, but he was not particularly good on the Victor. Ice has been like a non-factor for BDS outside of their week 1 games. It just doesn't feel good for this team right now. They are clearly outside the upper echelon echelon, and KOI is the upper echelon. Like, the top 4 teams all feel like absolute world beaters right now, and that's because they all feel super well-rounded. If Mirwin's gonna play super consistent, and if he's gonna have champions that he can play, regardless of whether or not he's getting those crazy counter picks on the top side, that's ginormous. That was the biggest problem for KOI last year, was Mirwin not really having any sort of consistency and not being particularly good in the regular season. Supa and Alvaro have carried over their good form. JoJo looks like a great addition and a huge upgrade in terms of the potential that they now have, and just generally the aggressive plays that they're able to make with the mechanical upgrade in the mid lane. And Elyoya has been pretty good at the start of this split. KOI looks excellent. They look like one of the best teams in the league in that top 4. But that's going to bring us to our day number 3, our third and final day of week number 2. And kicking us off on day 3, it's a matchup between Team Vitality and Rogue that Vitality is going to pick up a win in. They're going to move to 3-3, 500 through the first 2 weeks. That's a pretty great outcome for Vitality, considering just how things have started for them. Obviously, not everything has been perfect at the start of this split. It's definitely been an adjustment period for some of these players. I still don't think their jungle mid has been particularly consistent, even if GIANTX and Linsas show like good upside and definitely good potential moving forward. Their bot lane is very aggressive, and as much as I like top lane, he's not exactly been a perfect player here, but this is the kind of game where you can really start to express a lot of the positive movement that you've made over the course of this offseason, because Rogue is just not the kind of team that can put up like a ton of resistance against that, and that's exactly what happened. On Rogue's side, oh my god, they might have the worst player in the LEC right now. We'll talk about Patrick, but he is just making so many mistakes, like so many positioning errors, getting himself caught in bad situations, losing 2v1s. Like, it's awful. It's worst case scenario right now for Patrick. This looks like a guy who should not even be close to the LEC in his current state. Again, maybe it's just bad form, but this is a bad trajectory for a player that was already not looking great at the end of 2024. So we'll get into that, but starting with Vitality, player of the game for me is going to go to Hylissang in the support position. Hard to give it to anybody else. Like, he was so aggressive, so greedy in this game, and he was able to get away with basically all of it. 2 deaths on Hylissang when he's playing this aggressive is just unfair. Like, Rogue never really stood a chance. This is one of those games that you keep Hylissang on for, regardless of how he ended up playing in 2024 and being super inconsistent, even though I do think he was better than people give him credit for, and regardless of the fact that up until this point, he still has been pretty inconsistent in 2025. This was a really, really solid game, and you're just not going to get star performances like this from the support position out of many other supports in the region. It's a very difficult position to play at a crazy high level, and Hylissang definitely executed it there. Karzi continues to be good. Like, he's had a very consistent start to the year, still playing really aggro, but again, really gets away with it when he's playing against these exploitable AD carries on the other side. GIANTX was really good in this game on the Victor. This is one of the more consistent Victor games we've seen. We've seen the champion do well and have a pretty decent win rate, but not necessarily be a focal point for how a lot of these teams have wanted to play out their like mid and late games. GIANTX was a lot more involved, I would say, here than a lot of the other mid laners that we've seen pilot the champion. Linsas had a really good game, was definitely better than Malrang. Knock is a psychopath, and he makes Cassante look like the most fun champion in the entire world. It really was enjoyable watching him. He is like a highlight reel of a player. He's just going to have a standout moment from basically every single game that he ends up playing. He's super fun to watch, and I really do like him moving forward. But, at the end of the day, it's a Cassante game, and it's not like he was super influential throughout the entirety of it. This was mostly Hylissang creating opportunities for Karzi and GIANTX to be able to capitalize on. Linsas and, Knock were there as well, but Vitality just kind of looking good across the board and not really running into a ton of resistance, we'll just say, with Rogue in this game, who continue to look lost. Like, there's nothing else to say. It's not even that this team has bad synergy in the same way that I've talked about with a team like G2 or some teams in other regions that I've talked about. It more so just feels like this team doesn't have the talent level to be able to go toe-to-toe with a lot of the other teams. Like, they don't have a full, complete team's worth of talent. They have the worst player on the Rift in most of their matchups, that being Patrick in the bot lane. He's going to get yet another dud of the game. That's 3 dud of the games across their 3 games this week. He got 2 of them last week in their 2 losses. They've had 5 losses. He's gotten dud of the game in all 5 of them. It's really, really been an awful start for Patrick. I can't even remember the last time a player was this bad at the start of a split, especially someone as established as Patrick at the LEC level. Like, he's not been on a great trajectory. We talked about it multiple times in this video and obviously last year as well, things have been going downward for him, but this is a fallout in a way that we just have not seen from a player that at one point in time was considered a top 1 or top 2 AD carry in all of Europe, like in his prime. When we're talking about like 2021 Patrick, like that guy was looked at like one of the best players in the entire region, and now it just doesn't feel like he even should be here. It's not even like, what we've seen from some other players that have been, inconsistently bad, right? Like this is horrible. He's grading out unbelievably miserably. So him getting caught later on in the game and making all of the co-streamers freak out because of just how bad of a play it was, it's not even really all that surprising considering the form he's in. I don't really know what to do. I don't know if Rogue even has the money to get a replacement for him. That's certainly something to consider, is that if they bench or cut Patrick, they would have to sign another AD carry and then pay 6 players instead of 5. This is already supposed to be a budget roster, so I don't really know what the decision is there, but this guy cannot play in the LEC right now. Like, he is just entirely outmatched, and it looks like he is a bit cooked. Like, Execute's not exactly helping. He's had a really bad start to the split. Malring, I think, has been a non-factor. Adam has really fallen off after their week 1 win, like their day 1 win. He was really good in that game and hasn't really done anything since then. Larson was the only player in this game that was even remotely relevant, but Larson is not in carry mode right now. He is in, sit back and play really slow and safe until the late game kind of mode. And so, no, I don't feel good about Rogue. I feel like this is one of the worst teams in the league, and I think they're on pace to be bottom 2 in terms of, qualifying for those best of 3s. I think there's a real shot they don't. I'm not guaranteeing that that's the case. They still have an easy matchup against SK up ahead, but Vitality was definitely better than them, and it's not like Vitality are world beaters right now. Hylissang completely embarrassed Rogue, and Patrick, embarrassed Patrick, quite frankly. Chayak was fine, Linsas was fine, and if these are the players that are outclassing you, it's not good for Rogue. It's a good win for Vitality. This basically guarantees them to be able to get into the best of 3 stage so long as they don't completely shit the bed in the final week of the season. I'm not expecting this to be like a world-breaking team. I still think they're probably bottom 4 in terms of expectations, but they're definitely not bottom 2, which is a good one. But then moving on now to our second game of day number 3, and again, predictable outcome, top echelon of teams just kind of asserting their dominance. Fnatic taking on Team BDS, and Fnatic is going to pick up the win. Now, this was kind of a back and forth game, but Fnatic understood their win condition. The longer this game went on, the more difficult this was ever going to be for BDS to win. They picked this big early game, poke-oriented comp, like Renekton, Nidalee, Jace. They're very much indexing into trying to snowball the game out of control, and obviously the Varus kind of fits into that as well. They just aren't able to generate a big enough lead. 113 has his best game of the entire split, or certainly one of his best games of the entire split, a really good performance on the Nidalee, and they are able to generate a lead. It's just not big enough for Fnatic to do anything other than overcome it, because they themselves have their own superstar carry down in the bot lane in this one. Player of the game is very easily going to go to Upset in the AD carry role. He has been a completely different beast on Fnatic. It feels like the Fnatic version of Upset from 2022 has completely returned. For that player that obviously they really missed at the World Championships that year, and that player that kind of got them there in the first place. One of the best AD carries that we had seen in recent memory in the LEC. That player went to Vitality and things didn't work out there. Last year it was on Corp, and there were a lot of things that were going wrong on that team. Finally returns to Fnatic, gets a bot laner that he can play with relatively consistently in Mikyx, and everything does seem to kind of find itself in its nice little place. He has been so aggressive, he has been so willing to try and trade in a lot of these circumstances, and again, the problem with Upset that we've had for the past couple of years is that he doesn't push his advantages nearly as hard as he should. He is a really mechanically talented player that plays like he is the second or third best option on any given team, and that's just not something you really want to see out of an AD carry at this level. Well, aggressive Upset has woken up again. This guy is back to attempting to obliterate the enemy AD carry in the 2v2 and then play super aggressive in the mid to late game. Like, he is very willing to be the #1 option on this team, which is good because I do think that's probably their most consistent way of winning games, and this was a superstar level performance for him. This bot lane, both of them were just absolutely tremendous in this game against BDS. Ice is not a bad player. Upset made him look like an absolute Joe Schmo, we'll just say, in this game. Like, Upset completely outclassed Ice in basically every single way. Ice had a bad game. We'll get to it. Mikyx was also incredibly good on the rel. This bot lane looks like it has incredibly good synergy. That was something that I was a bit concerned about going into the season. It's really good to see that that's not going to be a problem for Fnatic moving forward. These two are playing off of each other well. Mickey's aggressive tendencies have actually translated really well into Upset's game, and generally I just think that they look like, again, one of the stronger bot lane duos in the league. It's funny because Noah and Jun look so good over on GIANTX, and Upset and Mickey are kind of matching that pace. Both bot lanes looking like mega upgrades for both of their teams, and the directions that they went in. I think Humanoid played his role here. He was Smolder, he was the late game insurance, and he did a lot of damage in the back half. Oscar was fine, certainly not a strength or a weakness, but done of the game is actually going to stay on Fnatic. It's going to go to Razork. He was trying his best to throw this game away for Fnatic. He does this every so often. It's the reason I was always lower on Razork for many years, is because you just kind of have to live with the fact that there are going to be some games every so often where he isn't in a good position after the early game and he doesn't really know what to do. I honestly don't blame BDS for wanting to go this like Renekton, Nidalee, Jace route, if only because it does throw Razork off to have to play from behind. He is so used to playing from an advantage state, like playing with a lead, that he really doesn't know what he's supposed to do when he doesn't have that lead. And he didn't in this game, and he did try to throw the game away, but Upset and Mickey were simply too good. This bot lane for Fnatic was simply too strong. They were always going to get them over the edge, like past the early and past the mid game, and allow Humanoid to get online, allow this Rumble to be able to start getting into fights. And then from that point onwards, the moment it reached like 35 minutes in this game, there was no way BDS was ever going to win. So, credit to Fnatic in that front. And then for BDS, like, I don't even want to be all that critical. They've played significantly worse games over the course of this split against worse teams. Like, this could have gone worse. I think the only mega critical thing I can say, and, the player that would get done of the game if Razork wasn't such a bad influence for Fnatic in this one, would have been Ice. I think Ice had his worst game of the entire split here. Just got outplayed in every capacity by Upset. He looked awful. Like, he just didn't have the mechanics to keep up with Upset. This is something I talked about with Ice. His mechanics aren't spectacular. He's a really good team fighter, but he's really not a good laner. Like, it's never been a huge problem for them because he's really good at going neutral, and, a lot of AD carries in the LEC just don't have the talent to be able to like completely obliterate him in that way. But as we saw here, if he does lose early, he can be a vulnerable threat down the stretch in these games. And Ice, he was just a problem. He wasn't particularly good. Irrelevant has been bad for BDS this year. Maybe not like awful. He's not actively losing games for them, but he's been a complete non-factor. He has been irrelevant on the top side, even though he is given resources. He's just not doing anything with them. He has been a massive downgrade, even to what Adam was at the end of last year, when Adam was kind of running it for BDS. This Irrelevant version, at least Adam was winning some games for this team. Irrelevant has been nothing for this team. Nuke, I don't think, had a particularly good week, even after he started off week number 1 pretty strong. Paris was fine in this game. I'm not blaming the Braum. And 113 was the best player on the team in this game on the Nidalee. He was able to generate an early lead, and he really took Razork off of his game at the start here. He just can't carry on Nidalee. Like, it's really hard to do so. Again, this is probably his best game of the entire split, but BDS is just not on the level with Fnatic, even if they did play well here. I think they would have beaten a lot of other teams. They did not beat Fnatic, and Fnatic is a genuinely great team. They are in that upper echelon for a reason. They're ending out week number 2, 5-1, and honestly, they might be the best team in the entire league. It genuinely kind of looks like that right now. I'm really excited to see where this team goes moving forward. Upset and Mickey look phenomenal, and Humanoid looks like he's in form right now. Oscar definitely looks like he's in form, and even with Razork kind of running it at the start here, he still was useful in the back half. It's just, you got to clean up on some of these things. Fnatic has so many good things going for them. This could be the year they finally return as LEC champions. Then moving on to our third game of day number 3, and it's finally time for this team to get back on track. It's G2 taking on GIANTX. Unfortunately, GIANTX does drop this. G2 is going to pick up the 27-minute kind of dominant victory after what was a ridiculous early game for Skewmond in the jungle. I hate the GX kind of had to be the ones sacrificed to G2 here, but it was about time that this team started playing like G2 ends up playing. They just absolutely wrecked the early game. This doesn't absolve them of a lot of their problems. There are a lot of things in this game that I'm really not sure are entirely repeatable. Like the lead that they were able to get pre-10 minutes, you're not going to get that in a lot of other games, and it made the rest of this game so easy to win. Like, this is a remake in terms of scrims if it ended up happening, off stage, but at the end of the day, a win is a win, and maybe this is the kind of momentum shifting, victory that they needed to get themselves back on track mentally. Player of the game is going to go to Skewmond. I really want to be excited about this because this is the best game that he has played at the LEC level. I do believe he played this game really well on the Zyra. Was able to create quite a bit for not only himself, but for the team later on in the game. But the way he got there is just so unrepeatable. Like, being able to get, 3 kills and 2 assists before 7 minutes into the game. Like, he had Leandries at 8 minutes. Like, there's just no way to be able to play that out if you're Nidalee, right? Like, there's no other way that you can play that out if you're Jace or if you're Varus. And obviously, part of it is their problem in the early game. Like, they created this monster, but it doesn't exactly tell me that G2's woes in the mid game have been fixed at that their objective setups are better or anything like that. It just means that Skewmon got super fed, and yes, he is going to be considered player of the game because he was the one that kind of drove this forward, but at the end of the day, like, I need to see him be put in some sort of adversity and still be able to come out on top, because this was about as free of a cakewalk as you could possibly ask for from a Zyra game, and obviously that's a positive in and of itself. He still was able to get that gigantic lead, but it's not exactly like it's something that I trust moving forward. The other player that played great here, Labrov. I think the bot lane in general had a really good game. The misfortune actually really worked out in G2's favor, and I think one of the things that I'm hoping G2 makes the adjustment to do is play a lot more for this 2v2. Obviously, Broken Blade and Caps should be receiving a lot of resources early. Specifically, Caps, you want to get him into a position where he can carry your late game team fights, but Hans is always at his best when he is the primary option in the early game, where he is strong side as an AD carry. That's kind of his thing. Like, that's the thing we know him for the most. And Labrov has really been struggling adapting to that. Like, he is obviously much more of a team fighter in terms of a support, but I think this time playing MF, you know, trying to win in the 2v2 really hard, it really worked out. Noah and Jun took a miserable fight early on in the game that obviously really worked out for G2, but Labrov was doing a great job at being able to punish a lot of those mistakes from that point onwards, whether it was Varus, whether it's Leona, or whether it was the Nidalee. The Nautilus was really important. So the two players who I think had been struggling the most on this team, Skewmon and Labrov, I think both played the best in this game for G2, which is big. Hans was good too. Caps and Broken Blade, though, along for the ride. The most encouraging thing, Caps was along for the ride, and this team still was able to win a game. We were talking about it earlier in the week. The big concern for me was that G2 could not win without Caps popping off. Well, here is a win without Caps popping off. Again, the only criticism I have towards this is that how repeatable is this game? How repeatable is it that the Zyra is going to get so fed early on and just be able to snowball it out of control? I don't know how repeatable that is, and that's something we're going to have to see. But for GX, obviously a disappointing loss. Everything falls apart in the early game. You pick Nidalee and Jace and Varus and Leona, another like early game poke-oriented comp with like a Smolder out in the mid game, and you know, your jungle loses super hard because the Zyra gets super fed, and your bot lane loses super hard because they take a miserable 2v2 trade in laning phase, and all of a sudden the game is over. Like, there's genuinely no way to play it out from that point. Whoever you want to give dud of the game to, I think, is kind of fair here. Closer was definitely the worst performing member of the team in this game, which is why he's going to get dud of the game for me. I do believe, like, just at the end of the day, if you're going to perform as bad as Closer did, regardless of the reason why he got into that situation, you probably are the dud of the game. But a lot of the reason he was in that position to begin with is because the Zyra got super fed off of the bot lane, and that there really wasn't a lot that the bot lane did in this game that was good. If you wanted to give this to Noah or Jun, I think that's also justifiable. Definitely a bit frustrating considering how good their start to the year had been, but at the end of the day, it's one game, like a best of one. I'm not going to freak out. I'm not going to sit here and say Noah and Jun being really good for 5 games before this and then not so good in this one means that they're actually really bad, or that Kozer is actually like the worst Nidalee player in the entire universe, although that one definitely a little bit more understandable. He's never been particularly good at Nidalee, but like Jackie's lot, they didn't really exist in this game. Nobody really got to play after the first 10 minutes. It was a free cakewalk of a win for G2, and they ended up taking it. GX, I think, will be fine. I think they're going to bounce back, but this is something to keep in mind that they kind of let this happen. And for G2, I don't think that this game is entirely repeatable. What you're hopeful for if you're a G2 fan is that this kind of reignites their confidence and gets them back on track in terms of being able to, you know, go into week number 3 and start to build some, you know, momentum in that regard. Because Skewmon and Labrov were both very good here. Specifically, Labrov, I think, had a lot of repeatable traits that he was able to pull out here. It feels like he is starting to adapt better to G2. If they're able to pull these versions of these players out, this is still, you know, in borderline a top 1 team in the entire league. They still have potential to be able to win the LEC regardless of their record. Then moving on to game number 4 of the final day here, and yet another top-tier team getting another big win. It's K-Corp taking on Team Heretics, and K-Corp picking up the victory here, and again, it's another player on K-Corp kind of emerging, and I know we said it earlier on in the week, but it's funny, we had Yike kind of really taking over in that first game, even with Kalist kind of like really taking a lot of the spotlight. Kalist was really the carry in game number 2, and then here, like, Vladi is going to be the guy that really takes a lot of the headlines for K-Corp in game number 3 this week. We said it earlier in the week, Vladi's kind of gone under the radar in terms of, you know, K-Corp right now because everybody else is just playing such like staggeringly good League of Legends, like Kana, Yike, Kalist. They're receiving so many resources and they've been so good individually in their roles. Even Targamas, his like rise from what he was last year to what he is this year, I think has really gained a lot of attention and a lot of, you know, praise from a lot of the fans. That Vladi has somehow, some way kind of gone under the radar. Well, not so much in this performance. He absolutely obliterates Team Heretics on the Victor. Completely outclasses Kamalu, who again, just doesn't look like he's particularly ready to play at this level. Shows flashes, but hasn't really had any extended period of time where he's looked good. And Vladi very much took advantage of that. This Victor was incredibly dominant, very, very fun to watch. If he's going to be able to consistently play like this, and you're going to get these kinds of performances out of the rest of this team, I mean, it's going to be over for basically everybody else in the league. Kana went out of his mind once again here on the Gnar. He's playing fantastic. Like, he might be the best top laner in the entire league at the current moment in terms of the form that he's in. Yike might be the best jungler in the entire league in terms of the form that he's in. Like, Yike is playing genuinely, unbelievably good League of Legends right now. I think he's going to get a bit undervalued just because, again, the rest of this team has been so good, but Yike is really the cog that makes the rest of this thing move. He's constantly on early game duty, and he's constantly tasked with getting a lot of these lanes super ahead. Kana's doing a great job in the 1v1s, but, you know, Kalista's got a lot of early game advantages thanks to Yike, and Vladi's gotten a lot of early game advantages thanks to Yike. I'm not trying to take away from their success. I'm trying to say that this is a very well-oiled machine on K-Corp, and Yike is a big part of why that machine is able to operate so consistently. Khalees gets a quadra kill at the end of this game on the Ezreal. He had a phenomenal week. He's really starting to cement himself in the upper tier of AD carries. A lot of the ADCs are doing well right now in the LEC, and Targamas has really stabilized. Like, all 6 games that this team has played, Targamas has been a positive for the team. That is a longer stretch than he has given really at any point in his entire career, so nothing but good things to say about K-Corp right now. This team is on fire. They're playing like one of the best teams in the entire league, right up there with Fnatic and KOI and, you know, all of these other teams that are really kind of dominating right now. But for Heretics on the other side, some good and some bad. I mean, this is kind of the expected outcome for Heretics against an actually good team. Their level 1 was a disaster. Both Sheo and Stend ended up playing that really horribly, and to me, that's kind of where I decided to try to give my dud of the game. I think if that level 1 goes even slightly differently, if they just play it slightly differently, I don't think the idea of a fight there is bad. I think the execution on that fight was awful, but I'm going to give it to Stend. He was really bad throughout the rest of this game. This bot lane in general was not good in this one, which is unfortunate considering that is typically the strength for Team Heretics, but you didn't really have a ton of advantages elsewhere. Flakked was trying to be aggressive. It's just Stend couldn't really do anything on the Braum. He wasn't really blocking a ton of the damage, and he was certainly not tanky enough to be a frontliner for this team moving forward. You could say similar things about Sheo, who I also considered here for dud of the game, but Kamalu got run over in the mid lane by Vladi. Again, he just feels kind of outmatched here, and Carlson is a complete non-factor on the top side. When he loses hard, and doesn't really seem like he wins all that hard either. He had a pretty good game on day number 1 here of week 2, but outside of that, like the other 5 games, they've just not been particularly impressive for me. Like, there are things on this Team Heretics team, but at the end of the day, this is still like a bottom, 3, bottom 4 team, something like that at the bare minimum. They could be bottom 2 in the league, depending on how things go next week. They're certainly not safe from missing out on the best of 3 stage, but they look like they're at the very least going to be kind of okay heading into that section, so long as they don't, completely die in week number 3. But K-Corp is one of the best teams in the entire league. It feels like they are super consistent from top to bot. Like, Kana, Yike, and Kalist in particular have been dominant. Vladi was excellent in this game, and it's not like he hasn't been excellent throughout an extended period of time. He just hasn't been quite as attention-grabbing as he was in this one. Targamas has even been really good for this team. There's really not a lot of negatives you can point to for K-Corp right now, which is just such a gigantic improvement over last year. But that's going to bring us to our final game of the week, our 5th and final game of day 3 here. And yeah, if we thought the other outcomes were obvious, this one is even more obvious. SK Gaming taking on Movistar KOI. And of course, KOI obliterates them. 17 kills to 1 in this game. It just wasn't even remotely close. I don't even know what to tell you. SK right now is playing like a bronze level flex team. And honestly, that's how the casters are treating them. That's how other teams that are playing them are treating them. It's genuinely absurd just how lost this team is. There's really not much to say here other than that, KOI is really good and SK is really bad, and it's a lot of different things. You can point to a lot of different areas for both of these teams, but this is going to be a pretty quick recap because there's really not a lot that I can say here that's going to be all that different from what I've already said for both of these teams this week already. So let's go ahead and get into it. Alvaro is going to get my player of the game. Mirwin got it on broadcast. I think you could give this to Supa. It should probably go to one of those 3, either Mirwin, Supa, or Alvaro. To me, it's got to go to Alvaro at some point. It feels like I've been debating giving him player of the game for all 5 of their wins, and I've not given it to him in any of those games. He's got to get it at some point, and this is as good of a game as any. The dude is just popping off at the current moment. Him and Supa are like near the top of the bot lane rankings. Like, they're up there with all of these other bot lanes that are playing well. Fnatic's bot bot lane, GX's bot lane, K-Corp's bot lane. Like, these are the guys that are really performing at a super high level, and Supa and Alvaro are very much in that conversation. Alvaro continues to really dominate on engagers. He's obviously a very versatile player, and Loopy has not really shown any resistance as a support. So far this split, he's kind of been gapped by basically everybody that he's played into. Not that everybody else on this team hasn't been in their roles, but Loopy in particular has been a massive disappointment, and Alvaro took full advantage of that. Just another phenomenal game from the Nautilus, but Supa was a primary damage carry throughout basically all of this game. His positioning was gorgeous. Mirwin was dominant on Ambessa. I get the banning of Cassante. It's something that you always had to do against KOI, or against Mad Lions last year, Mad KOI last year. Now it's got to be Cassante and Ambessa. These two champions fill very similar roles, and clearly Mirwin is maybe even more experienced and more comfortable on the Ambessa. He popped off even more in week 2 than he did in week 1. Like, he was unbelievable this week, and, you know, we'll talk about him a bit later once we get into the player of the week conversations, because he's absolutely in those conversations. But Mirwin playing out of his mind. Jojo looks super comfortable on this team, even though he got solo killed by Isma. Elyoya looked fantastic across this entire week as a facilitator for this team. KOI just looks so good across the board. Now, there are some concerning things for me. I still think Jojo is maybe a bit too aggressive against the will of his team. You know, I think he fits well in terms of being able to create pressure so that other lanes don't have, like, all of this pressure going into them in the same way that, you know, Supa and Alvaro were 3v2'd a lot last year because Frescowie wasn't really generating anything in the middle of the map. Jojo just existing kind of takes away that possibility for the bot lane, but Jojo can be too far forward at times, and, you know, we saw it here. He got solo killed by Isma. It wasn't really an ideal set of circumstances. That, and Elyoya hasn't been playing like a complete monster in the jungle. He's just been very good. Those are very minor criticisms, though. This team looks excellent. This bot lane looks phenomenal, and I'm really excited to see where KOI goes from here. And then for SK on the other side, like, they are just awful. They are the worst team that I could possibly evaluate at this level. Everything's going wrong. Like, look at this scoreline. Like, what do you even want me to say at this point? GIANTX is easily the worst top laner in the league. Reeker is easily the worst mid laner in the league, although Kamalu is kind of giving him a run for his money. Loopy is easily the worst support in the league. Isma has done some things, and he's not been the worst player on this team. Rahel is trying, but is definitely elo held here. I think he would do better in basically any other circumstance. There's just nothing else that I can say about SK. They're sitting at 0-6. It would take an absolute miracle for them in week number 3 for them to do anything other than go bottom 1 in this entire league. It's just as disastrous as it could possibly get. Maybe something ends up turning around for SK, but this configuration of this roster, it's just not working. This reminds me so much of K-Corp from last year. Like I said, kind of a combination of Rogue in terms of their passiveness in the early game, and K-Corp in terms of the fact that it just seems that a lot of these players are outmatched in their individual roles. It took K-Corp swapping out a lot of those players for Kana and for Vladi midway through last year for them to get better. Might take the same thing for SK here, finding someone else to be able to promote, but whatever it is right now, 0-6 is a deserved start for how this team has been playing. And KOI looks excellent. 5-1 is really strong. I don't know if I consider them as consistent as a team like Fnatic or as a team like K-Corp right now, because those teams are just clicking on a ridiculous level. But if KOI is, like, behind them, that's crazy. That just goes to show how strong the LEC is at the current moment. KOI is sitting at 5-1, and they are a real threat to win the LEC, which is, I think, something a lot of people were hoping was going to be the case. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LEC Winter Split Week number 2 overview and analysis of all 15 games. Up on the screen, the standings after 2 weeks of action with only 1 to go. Of course, bottom 2 teams are eliminated at the end of this Winter Split, at the end of this best of 1 regular season. It's the exact same format as last year, which means you just have to get top 8, and that means that we actually have a couple of teams that are already locked in. Fnatic, K-Corp, Movistar KOI, they're guaranteed to be top 8. There is no way that even with every worst case scenario possible happening that they would get bottom, 2. It's just not possible at 5 wins. They've guaranteed themselves. I think we can chalk in teams like GIANTX, G2, and Vitality into a similar, scene where it would be kind of a disaster if something ended up going wrong and they ended up getting bottom 2 or even being in a tiebreaker. 3 wins is almost certainly going to be enough to get you across the finish line, but still a lot to go. And of course, we still have my personal power rankings, which are to the right of every single team. You can see it under the power rank column. Change is going to be how they have changed from last week to this week, so we can go over risers and fallers. Top 3 is going to completely adjust. It's going to be the 3 teams sitting at 5-1, because right now I do think they are the 3 best teams in the league. I'd love to keep G2 at the top of these power rankings, but I just can't justify it right now. They're not playing like a top 3 team. If they were, showing a lot of those top 3 instincts or top 1 instincts in their wins or even in their losses, like I would really start to like believe it, because we've seen in the past that this team can still, go down like 3-3 early and then come back and win the league. Like they should still be favorites, right? Well, I don't know. This version does feel a little bit different. They feel a lot more disconnected, and even in their wins, they don't feel particularly strong right now. Fnatic's going to jump to number 1. K-Corp's actually going to jump KOI and move up to number 2, because right now I do think K-Corp is the second best team in the league. Hell, they might be the best team in the league right now in terms of the form that they're in. I'm super high on how K-Corp is playing. Love the gameplay for them right now, but top 3 could all go really in whatever direction you want to put them in. The only reason Fnatic's at number 1 is because we kind of had a feeling that they were going to be near the top in the preseason. They had the biggest expectations and they're living up to it, but quite frankly, in terms of form, I think K-Corp might be the team that I feel the best about right now. I think they are playing genuinely unreal. G2's only going to fall to number 4, though. That win over GIANTX saves them from going further, and honestly, if you wanted to keep them at number 1, I would be pretty willing to do that just because it's G2. They haven't really shown anything on tape to lead me to believe that that is a good take to have right now, but it's Caps, it's G2, like they're gonna be fine. They're still probably gonna win the finals, and that's just kind of how things go around here. GIANTX, unfortunately, after the 1-2 week, is gonna drop 1 spot. I think both of their losses are super justifiable, and I still think this is a really good team, but, we had to make room for somebody else somewhere, so they dropped to number 5, and then I think that's where you get the drop-off. The top 5, I think, are clearly the top 5, and then everybody else is kind of fighting it out. BDS will stay at 6, Vitality will stay at 7. If you wanted to move BDS down more because they went 0-3 this week, I do kind of understand that, but I think they're better than Vitality. I would expect them to be better than Vitality moving forward. Heretics is going to leapfrog Rogue, though, moving up to 8. I think Rogue will be number 9 by the end of this split, and I think they will be the second team to miss out. Of course, SK staying at number 10. That's not even really all that up for debate. This is the worst team in the LEC, and it's not particularly close. But let me know what you think of these power rankings down in the comment section below. Always curious to know you guys' thoughts and opinions, but let's go ahead and get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 2. Here, player of the week, it's going to go to Mirwin, the top laner for Movistar KOI. I thought he was the best player in the entire league this week. His Ambessa was genuinely ridiculous, and teams didn't really have an actual answer for it, especially on days 2 and 3. Where he was able to make a ton of highlight plays. I was really genuinely impressed with how Mirwin played. I think there are other options, though. So many players in the LEC had great weeks. Kalist was obviously the other, I guess, notable one, the obvious one for a lot of people, and I think a lot of people are going to give it to Kalist. I think K-Corp in general was so good across the board that it was hard for me to look at one player and say that they were definitely better than their teammates, so if you wanted Kalist here, great. If you wanted Yike as an honorable mention here, I think that that's totally fine as well. He had an amazing week in the same vein, but Kalist, Mirwin, I think it should be one of those 2 for player of the week. And then I wanted to give a big shout out to Upset as well here for Fnatic, who had a fantastic week in his own right. He's starting to get a lot more aggressive. He's starting to take his own destiny into his own hands, which I think is a major positive for him. And just generally, I'm excited for the direction that this Fnatic team is going. That bot lane looks super legit right now, but basically anybody from KOI, K-Corp, or Fnatic could be selected for these player of the week and honorable mention spots because they were all super good. Dud of the week, unfortunately, was also very, very obvious. It's gotta go to Patrick. I mean, there's nobody in the LEC who's playing as bad as Patrick right now, and that's including GIANTX, who in almost any other week would have gotten it here. Even someone like 113 was in consideration for me. That final game of the week on day number 3 definitely kind of raised his stock and took him out of this conversation, but this was not a difficult decision. Patrick is just playing absolutely miserably right now. I mean, there's just no way to say it. Like, this does not look like an LEC even like caliber player. Like, he doesn't look like a C graded player. He looks like a D graded player right now in terms of how he is playing. He is just completely outclassed in almost every way at the start of this split. Things have to get better for him. If they don't, he's got to get benched because, like, he is single-handedly dragging Rogue to bottom 2. I think they could be a team that's somewhere around 500 right now if they had, like, a semi-competent AD carry. They just don't really have that. So Patrick's going to be my dud of the week for week number 2, and Mirwin is going to be my player of the week for week number 2. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We'll, of course, be covering the rest of the LEC year, winter, spring, summer, all of the good stuff, the international tournaments, but we also cover all 4 of the major regions every single week on this channel. So LTA week 1 will be out tomorrow, and then, of course, we've done LCK and LPL videos the past couple of weeks. You can check those out, or hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But, of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.